Hey everybody, welcome to the show. A little bit of a rearranging. I think I teased last week at the end that I was, or on the end of the last episode, that this week was going to be with kind of a goofier one with Scott Barry Kaufman, and he's the author of a goofy, just like we were. He writes awesome books, but goofy in that we were super playful and had a bunch of laughs. But anyway, he wrote a book, Transcend, the New Science of Self-Actualization, all about kind of rethinking Maslow's hierarchy of needs in a modern world, or with the science that has advanced since that time. And so that's actually going to be next week now. Been a lot of moving pieces with a bunch of different projects. I won't get all into it. I'll talk a bunch at the end because I have a bunch of things that I've been releasing this month, including my new podcast, Mind Under Matter, with Ramin Nazer, who's joining us in this episode for kind of a little bit of a role reversal episode with return guest C Shawn Green, and talking all about we're going to be blending kind of the idea of different cognitive biases and applying them to the world of comedy. I think you're really going to enjoy this episode quite a bit. And I wanted to, at the end of the episode, talk about a few of the things that I have going on. But one thing that I wanted to mention was that if you've seen some of, like, last year, we really started getting the scheduling of the show dialed in and a lot more consistent. And this month it's been just slightly off because of starting up the new show and rearranging some things. We're now doing Here We Are is dropping every Wednesday now. So you can count on it every Wednesday. Count on it. We're going to miss some here and there and make up for it in double week episodes. But you can typically count on it every single Wednesday. And so this is at least the working schedule that we're playing around with. And Mind Under Matter is going to be every Monday with Ramin and I. And then every Friday, there's a special Mind Under Matter Patreon bonus show called Mind Under Art that we're doing. And so we're kind of spacing things out for editing's sake and allowing more post-production time and that sort of thing. And adding some other stuff to my Patreon, like I just released my Good Trip, the only ever recording of that came out, and that's on there. And speaking of which, I did my first Reddit AMA. We rescheduled me and Pete's AMA, which we talked about in his episode, but we did a AMA for Psychonautics. It went really, really well. It was the most popular AMA of the day, top 10 of the week or something. I didn't look. It kept on climbing over the following days, but it was really cool. So if you want to go and check that out, maybe I'll try to put a link to it somewhere. But if you go into Reddit AMA or Google my name on there or whatever, it should pop right up. New to Reddit. And just wanted to fill you in on the new schedule and just let you know that if you've been liking the things that I've been putting out, or if you've been following me on Instagram and seeing some of the new stuff that we've been announcing, that is nothing. I haven't, my assistants had a couple weeks off for vacation. We're getting a few things clicking into place still, and there's going to be tons of more awesome things coming your way really soon. So I'm super excited. And so just wanted to let you guys know that and enjoy today's episode.
Are we?
Yes.
Where are we?
Here.
Why are we here? Not entirely clear. We are misfits thrust into existence by random chance, with no hints at all as to how we're supposed to make sense of it all. It's immensely bizarre. Here we are.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Here We Are podcast. I have a very unique, special episode for you guys today. We have two guests, and we're also turning the tables a little bit. So I have one, my very good friend, Ramin Nazer, who we have at the time you're hearing this, we have launched our podcast, Mind Under Matter, which you can check out mindundermatterpodcast.com, and you can hear us. It's kind of, Ramin and I have been friends for a very long time and have big, fun philosophical conversations about work and motivation and comedy, business, and all that sort of thing. Regularly, we started recording them for you guys, the listener. If you aren't familiar with Ramin's artwork, check it out at raminnazer.com. He's blowing up on Instagram, and he's fantastic. And he's joining me today because I am my academic guest for today is return guest Shawn Green from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who is assistant professor of psychology, right, Shawn?
Associate now. I think the first time I did it, I hadn't been promoted. So,
nice. Associate professor, and your kind of research areas are cognition and cognitive neuroscience and perception. But you listeners might remember you as the video game guy. Can you give people that haven't heard you on the show before just a little bit of your spiel?
Yeah, sure. So the research that my lab focuses on is how we can improve human cognitive function and perceptual function. So are there types of dedicated training that people can do that will make them see better, think more quickly, make faster decisions? And so one of the types of training that my lab utilizes are playing various very fast-paced video games. These put a lot of load on the perceptual and cognitive systems, and we've seen lots of positive impact in the realm of perception and cognition from playing those types of games.
Are these custom-made games, or you like pull up Super Meat Boy or something?
So we both. The nice thing about custom games is that they're well controlled, and so good for science in that way. But they're often just less good than commercial games. So lots of our research, literally has people play Overwatch or, first-person shooters like Team Fortress Classic was actually my PhD thesis. We've used Call of Duty, Medal of Honor, real commercial games.
And
cool.
You're an actual developer too, right?
I am not a developer. Funnily, there is a well-known developer named Shawn Green.
Is that what it is? That's
Correct.
I was like,
yes. So he was one of the developers for Doom.
And
the
like
original.
when your name's Dennis, you're very likely to become a dentist. Is that like the sort of situation?
I think both me, C Shawn Green, and Shawn Green are probably just trying to not be confused by the baseball player. But yeah, someone sent me, if you search for Shawn Green now, you get this weird amalgamation of us both. You get his bio and my face. I don't know if he gets asked to do interviews about cognitive neuroscience, but I do get asked to give interviews about Doom.
You guys have to collaborate one day, like when the Will Ferrell and the Red Hot Chili Peppers drummer had to have a drum off because they look similar.
First off, what are they paying for these Doom gigs? I mean, I'm sure you could wing it.
It's like, oh, yeah. So there was one very particular, because I thought that they were interested in my research because it uses first-person shooters like Doom. And then the first question is, so when you were making Doom, I'm like, oh, when I was making Doom, I don't think I can wing this.
You're thinking of the other Shawn Green. I actually had, before we get into this, I'm on the producer of my documentary Psychonautics, a comics exploration of psychedelics. His name's Matt Schuler. There's a Matt Schuler that follows me on all of the social medias and is like into comedy and stuff. My Matt Schuler is like makes comedy specials and stuff like that. And so I never look at social media much. I just assumed it was him. Like I would see Matt Schuler likes your post or whatever, assumed it was him. One day we were like writing back and forth during COVID, and he's like saying like we're like making fun of people's response to COVID or whatever. It was like all the same sort of stuff that I'd be saying with my Matt Schuler. And then I was like, hey, do you want to just like video chat right now? And then he's like, you know what? Yeah, I was in bed with my lady, but let me get on a bed, grab a beer. And then he video chats me on Instagram, and it was one of those things where like your brain doesn't understand what's happening for a minute. So I was like, did Matt grow hair or start wearing a wig? And
did you let him in on it, or did you just pretend that you wanted to talk to a normal guy?
My face was enough. He was like, I'm a different person than you thought I was, aren't I? Anyway, great catching up. Fun anecdotes aside, let's get into the brass tacks of what this episode's about. So Sean reached out to me and he was like, hey, could you come and be like a guest speaker or something in my class? I've been teaching a psychology. What is Psychology 101, Sean? Or
Yep, Introduction to Psychology.
And we've been learning a bunch about cognitive biases. I've been having different people from different fields come in and kind of, I think about what cognitive biases might apply to their fields, and then asking them, the people that actually do this stuff, how in line my idea of these things is, and speak a little more to, enlighten us on these types of the psychology of their job, essentially. How is that as an explanation?
I think that's great. My goal is that I don't want my students to come away thinking that psychology is all Pavlov's dog and these very kind of abstract, non-real world. It's like psychology is all around us. So the things that they learn about as heirs of memory show up in lots of jobs, like for instance, comedy.
So we aren't going to be talking about video games today like we normally would. Normally I'd be asking, I know, Ramin's so upset. Normally I'd be asking Sean a bunch of questions. Instead, Sean's going to be asking us two comedians questions based on a number of different psychology concepts. So let's get into it, Sean. How do you want to start?
Sure. Why don't we start with memory biases? So kind of a whole section of my class talks about the fact that people's memories are not nearly as accurate as they believe them to be. There's lots of very characteristic errors that we make with regard to our memories. So one of these, kind of broadly speaking, are called misattribution errors. They're when you don't recall the origin of a memory. So for instance, maybe you remember meeting a person and you think it was at a party, but actually you'd seen them in a class or something like that. And so there's one subtype that's called 𝕊𝕙𝕒𝕟𝕠𝕪, but colloquially called unintentional plagiarism. Basically, it's as it sounds. You think you came up with an idea, but actually you had heard it somewhere in the past. You don't have any recollection that's where it came from. And so obviously as comedians, you spend lots of time listening to other comedians tell jokes. And stealing jokes is a big issue, I know, in comedy. So can you think of situations where this error has been made? Are there ways that you try to guard against it? How do I know that I came up with this and it wasn't a bit that I saw 15 years ago?
I mean, normally a Google search is like one level of defense. I know it's not everything because that joke might not be recorded already by someone. It might not have been transcribed somewhere. Kind of asking around if it seems like a very obvious one is a good go-to move. And it reminds me of this old Louis C.K. bit where he would tell a story and it's like, you ever tell a story that happened to someone else as yourself? And then he does that, and then eventually he tells it to the person he stole it from, and then the person says, that didn't happen to you, that happened to me. And then he's like, oh, I guess it did, huh? And
yeah. And yeah, there's a lot of like, Dane Cook comes to mind as there's a whole like, did Dane Cook steal from Louis C.K.? There's always that kind of stuff going on, but then there legitimately is lots of parallel thinking too. There's situations where ideas are just like a pretty obvious kind of emergent property of the situation you're in. If it's your first time doing stand-up, if you watch 50 people do stand-up for the first time, several of them are going to do a joke comparing it to losing their virginity.
All of them.
Maybe all of them. And it's not that they saw someone else do that. It's just kind of like an obvious association to make in that situation. And so it's a little hard of a thing to police sometimes, because it's like a lot of times you see a comic you say something and then you go up to him and you're like, oh, I have a bit like that. And you usually recognize like, oh, we both have this joke. I remember like seeing John Doerr and being like, oh, I have a joke similar to that about like people blaming homosexuals for causing hurricanes or whatever. And then they're like, all right, well, we both came up with the same thing. Like, who gets it? Like, well, you already recorded on TV, so that's yours, and we sorted out that way. But definitely, Ramin and I were just talking about something somewhat related, which is I'll be the I'm the headlining act a lot of times. There's a host and there's a feature act, and a feature will have like an interesting kind of mannerism or way in which they deliver jokes. And after 5 shows, I'll find myself inadvertently taking on that kind of style a little bit, kind of like when people go and visit Australia and come back being like, "Toese," we just adapt.
Yeah, it happens with negative things too. Like if someone says like too much or whatever too much, like you know what I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like you start to subconsciously just mimic them. So good habits and bad habits can rub off on you sometimes.
And then there's another thing. I forget what kind of cognitive bias or what the psychological term for this would be, but it's very similar and almost the opposite from an audience point of view, which is the audience, the like, less comedy savvy audience of people that like, maybe they've been to a couple comedy shows in their life or whatever. They've seen a couple comedians on TV before. They'll often see a comedian and they'll be like, oh, you know who you reminded me of? Seinfeld. And it's just because that's the one comedian, that's their like one basis of comparison that they have. So it fluctuates. Like when Daniel Tosh got popular, people will be like, you remind me of Daniel Tosh. Or like early on, I had like a darker delivery or whatever. People will be like, you're kind of like a dirty Stephen Wright or something like that. And then I get Jim Gaffigan sometimes as well. Actually, I probably get that one the most. We're both from the Midwest. And so then the audience will be like, you're just ripping off Jim Gaffigan. Like, no, we're both ripping off a Midwestern upbringing.
Yeah.
So
we just steal them is the answer.
Yeah,
so we just steal it and
joke thieves.
I think the essence is at least getting yourself to a point that you don't remember that you're stealing them. It's plausible deniability. Mm-hmm. So another memory bias is people have a really strong tendency to remember things from, say, the beginning and end of sequences. We call these the primacy and recency effects. So like if a drug company is giving a list of side effects, people will tend to remember the stuff that's at the beginning of the list, the stuff that's at the end of the list. and they will forget the stuff in the middle of the list. And so I can imagine for a performer who's giving a show, do you kind of structure your show in such a way that the kind of things that are going to stick best with the audience are the things that you want to stick best? So like start strong, end strong kind of phenomena?
You nailed it. Yeah. And I remember
was that an Australian accent?
Yeah, you're supposed to never open with new stuff unless you really know what you're doing and you just want to see if something can work as an opening thing. That's when you'll try it initially. But really, if you're gonna try new material, you sandwich it in the middle or you pepper it throughout the set, and you rely on the tried and true throughout. But now that makes me think of with a drug commercial. So you're saying that they put death and diarrhea and depression in the center, and then the first thing is like hair growth and extra energy at the end of the list? Because I never really picked up on that. Is that what they do?
So, I mean, in some cases, probably it's hard to hide things like death, but wherever you put it in the list. But, certain things, that would be at least the suggestion from that memory literature is that if you want people to forget stuff, you'd stick it in the middle. It certainly comes up with things like auditions, for instance. People who are auditioned early or auditioned late or job interviews, like in the process, will be remembered better than the folks in the middle. So, I know that so there's lots of places that kind of general phenomena. We remember the early ones, and remember the late ones, and stuff in the middle just tends to get forgotten.
Well, and in addition to that, I think the peak end rule seems to come in quite a bit in comedy, which is I guess you could help me out if you want, Sean, but basically rather than your brain calculating the like entire mass of units of like 𝕊𝕐𝕬𝕪s that you get through a whole show and then averaging that out and being like, that show was a 7. Instead, the brain tends to overweight kind of those peaks, the best, most memorable laugh of the night, like when I do my Hot Pockets routine, and then the end of the show, that big closer, and that's what you'll hear often from people afterwards. You can do, and I have many times struggled for 30, 40 minutes, and then was able to just get them that by the last like 15 minutes or so, like I'm killing it. And like, whew, I'm glad that worked out. But man, that first 45 minutes was absolutely brutal. And it's like complete amnesia. It's like they don't even remember that the majority of the show just was not well received. And it's amazing, actually. And then they'll often have their like favorite joke that they'll kind of repeat back to you after the show.
And so we'll sometimes, it sounds a lot like what we might call availability bias. Basically, things that are more easy to remember are viewed as being more likely or more common, and it's often used as why we overestimate the probability of, say, shark attacks because they're very available in memory. We underestimate the likelihood of, dying from the flu, not particularly available in memory.
You're not picturing cells going in and hijacking other cells, and like and most people are taken off in a hospital somewhere, out of sight, out of mind. But
there's no theme song, doo-doo for flu.
Yep, so presumably for the part where you struggle, it's not really forming any memories, and so people aren't remembering that it happened, right? They're overemphasizing the parts that they remember that are available, unless the whole thing goes up.
So you just can't be so bad that it's incredibly painful. You just got to be not memorable for the first half.
If there's something so bad it's painful, they'll definitely remember that. You don't want that weighted in there. So yeah, we could switch topics here. So intro psych, we cover like all of psychology, obviously. And so one big area is social psych. And there's a phenomenon called the fundamental attribution error, basically where we're trying to figure out the causes of people's actions. Is it because of something inherent to them, or is it caused by the situation? So classic example might be someone bumps into you on the bus. Are they clumsy? Are they rude? Are they aggressive? Or did the bus driver swerve, right? And we have to make these inferences to know how to respond. If it's because the bus driver swerved, you're going to respond differently than if it's because it's your friend who bumped you, or if it's because they're aggressive. And so people have a really strong tendency to make this error, which is to assume that people's actions are caused by things inherent to them, even if they're caused by the situation. So the very classic experiment is one where they had participants read a speech that was either pro or anti-Castro. This is back when Castro was relevant. So you could tell how old the study was. And then they asked the people, how pro or anti-Castro do you think the speechwriter was? And people assumed that, well, if they wrote a pro-Castro speech, they're probably pro-Castro. If they wrote an anti-Castro speech, they're probably anti-Castro. And they made that assumption even if the researchers told them that the topic of the speech was assigned by a coin flip. So we flipped a coin. This person got anti-Castro. How anti-Castro do you think they are? And people assume that despite the fact they know it came from the situation, they assume it's still internal. So in the case of comedy, what are the kind of assumptions that people make about you? I'm assuming that things that you say as part of your comedy jokes reflects your real feelings. That the reason you're doing this, you're making this joke about this, group is that you're a misogynist or you're a racist or, you really hate this type of people.
And while those may be true, that's not the reason that I said the jokes.
Yeah,
I think comics, especially with the many of them are upset about college campuses and cancel culture and this kind of thing, and it often gets brought up that like Kevin Bacon or whoever can play a pedophile or a rapist on a movie, and that's okay. But then if you make a joke, even it's not supporting it in any way, just bringing up the concept of touchy subjects, you get aligned with, oh, you're co-signing that you're okay with racism, murder.
Yeah, but for that to be a perfect study, you would need Kevin Bacon to do stand-up and see if he could get away with the same thing. It might just be the Kevin Bacon effect. So yeah, this is not to like pat ourselves on the back, but and like Ramin and I are one of a kind, but we're peculiar people. We write odd jokes. Like either one of us is likely to have, like if we go to like a chuckle hut in Tallahassee, like the audience might be like, what in the hell are they talking? And so we're not like as in danger of like lifting jokes. I often feel like if I hear someone else do a thing about dying and then becoming molecules and those molecules bumping into each other in the universe, I'd be like, you got that from Ramin Nazer. The reason I bring it up here is because the strangest thing happens, which is I'll say a true story and people don't believe it. And then I'll say the most ridiculous thing. And like, I'll tell some time travel joke and they're like, so what was it like to time travel? And then I'll be like, so I'll tell a 12-minute story about like going to the Duck Dynasty musical. And they're like, that wasn't real, was it? I'm like, you think I just made up that 20-minute long story? But then the 10-second time travel quip was like, so it's strange, but I can see that, Sean, and I've also never thought about it before, and it makes me reevaluate the things that I've said in the past. Like, oh, I thought we were just kidding around here.
Yeah, and it's a hard one, right? Like whether people assume that it's because you're a comedian or assume it's because you deeply believe it. You could certainly imagine people making that error. I
think that's why. Sorry to interrupt. I think that. Oftentimes if a comic is very clean, or let's take like Pee Wee Herman, what's his name, Paul Rubens, when like back in the 80s or 90s when he was in the porn theater and like was beating off in public and got in trouble for that. I think it was because he's the child star or kids show thing.
Bob Saget's a good example of this
Oh
too.
yeah, when it conflicts with who they are on stage, they get in more trouble than like, let's say Jim Norton is just well-known perv and like doesn't ever get in trouble because he's already presenting as a deranged person. But if you're very wholesome and then you're caught doing something off stage, then it's...
Yeah, like Doug Stanhope on his last special was talking about how he's like never been Me Too'd and like and like of all the like it's always like the clean cut people or whatever that it ends up happening to or whatever. So yeah,
Cosby is the greatest example of that.
Oh yeah. Every time I see Seinfeld, I'm always just like, what is that guy hide? Like, he has some weird stuff going on. So
I think he spends too much time with cars and stuff to make time for
to be a
any
serial killer or something.
Yeah, but who knows, maybe.
I don't know.
So sticking in social psych, kind of a big topic is stereotypes. It's very human to try to put people into a category and then reason from the category. But one thing we tend to do is assume that everyone is kind of the center of the category, when obviously people vary widely. So I'm wondering, what are some things that people assume about you? What are the stereotypes about comedians? Or people just assume that they know something about you because of the fact that they've stuck you in the comedian bin that doesn't really work.
Oh dear God.
if you joke a little, if you have one joke about psychedelics or about, getting too drunk or something, they assume that you're getting smashed every single night or you're doing psychedelics every single night. You might have never done psychedelics or have only done them, 5 years ago or something, but because you're presenting yourself in this 30-minute to hour set, like they imagine that your day-to-day life is the stuff you just joked about. You wake up, you do the psychedelics, you yell at your aunt, you whatever is the thing.
Yeah, you've compiled your 10 years of like drinking stories into a 30-minute set, and then afterwards, like, whoa, that guy's crazy. Like, well, we've all been 30 minutes of crazy in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
One interesting one is people just can't believe how tall I am when they see me afterwards. And it's the same as like when they see an actor, they can't believe how short an actor is. People just assume that when they have no way of like measuring, someone's on stage, someone's on a screen or whatever, they just assume this is a person of average height, and so that happens. Some of the peskier assumptions people make is that because you're a comedian, you're going to make fun of them. It's like a lot of like spotlight effect kind of stuff. So you're at a party, and I used to carry a notepad with me everywhere, and I still enjoy having a pad to pen notepad, but it's just easier in a social situation to think of a joke like, no, I didn't think of a joke about you. Actually, when you were talking, I zoned out, thought about something more interesting, thought of a joke about that, and that's what I'm writing down.
Yeah.
But if you pull out a notepad, now it's just like, oh my gosh, this is like the this like undercover cop or something like that, that's like taking our secrets, making fun of like how stupid we're acting right now, and they're just gonna travel around the country talking about how dumb the thing we said at the party was or whatever. And just that's a very, very common thing. I know it's not exactly related to your what's it called, the center, but
no. Now
What was it again? Center curious.
It's basically once people form stereotypes, they assume everyone is too much like the center of the category.
But what was the term though? What's the term?
Just
I think it's just.
I thought it was called like center bias or something.
Just stereotyping. It's something that goes along when people have stereotypes. Is they assume everyone is too like the center, and that they kind of ignore the fact that even if you can categorize people as comedians, there might be a center, but there's like a lot of variation. And very few people.
Also the zinging too. They think that you're going to keep coming with the jokes as you're off stage when maybe you'll only make a joke every 20 sentences instead of every like bang 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 bang.
That's I mean, Ramin's maybe a little more on in real life than I don't know. It's tough to tell, but either way, the average audience just like I like writing, and then I get on stage and my audience is just like the measure of like, oh, did that joke and delivery worked the way that I thought it would? I don't get much from like the glow of the stage and the laughter, the validation. It's just like, okay, that worked the way that I thought it would, or it didn't. And then I'm done, and I'm like, okay, now I'm gonna have a drink at the bar. Like I'll have one with you as well, but I'm a normal person now, and people expect you to be like on all the time. It just
occurred to me, we were about to say the exact same thing. I think how there's people that
Jimmy Pardo or something.
Yeah, they prove that to be true. Sometimes you see someone on stage and they're a very goofy character, and you're like, that's a crazy character they're doing. And then you meet them off stage and you're like, oh my God, he actually is this manic and this like he is that crazy character. I thought he was amping it up for the stage, but he's actually very troubled and going in and out of mood swings in a single sentence. And he's up here, and then by the end of the sentence, he's down here, and find out that he hangs himself, and 3 years later.
Yeah, I guess I probably fall in that category. But Jimmy Pardo is an example of the always on people that are actually do it and do it well, and it's not forced, and it's just who they are. And it's not annoying, but there are comedians that try to embody that, like zip zap. They usually do a lot of like crowd work and stuff.
Jimmy
like
Pardo,
that.
Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
So sticking with stereotypes, I mean, obviously, in the history of comedy, I think it's fair to say that lots of comedians have kind of leaned into stereotypes as foundations for their comedy, whether it's race or gender or sexual orientation or religion. Given where we are today, you can imagine that there'd be backlash against, using stereotypes as foundation. So have you seen any changes in the last 5 years with regard to, how that works? Like whether there's awareness of it, whether some people just say, I don't care.
Well, I think it's gotten much more sensitive, of course, and anything that can be interpreted as offensive, you will at least have some section of people that are calling it out and not okay with it. Whereas, but it's interesting because that used to be hack to do, like to be too racial or too like gendery or something, and then it wasn't offensive though, it was hack, and then it became offensive but not so much hack. Does that make sense?
So now it's like edgy. So there's a lot of like buckle your seatbelts. There's a lot of like there's always a lot of build up with those. So there's kind of two different camps that have like popped up over the last decade or so. And one was like the big kind of indie meltdown comics, everyone is like super liberal and talking about comic books and gay rights and that
Can
sort of stuff.
Can Republicans just like not?
And then there was this big backlash to it, which is where all like the virtue signaling stuff came out of, and now there's like the red pill of like everyone's too soft and you can't say it in this cancel culture. And so that's like, so then during COVID, there's like, you can imagine the type of people going out to a live comedy show are going to be a little more toward the
right,
the
a little more to the right,
and so they're easier to pander to in that that's the type. So the same type of crowd that falls for the usual like cookie cutter. You show up to a comedy club and they're like, okay, here's our street that has a funny name. Here's the colors of our sport team. If you just say those colors and they'll clap a lot. And and here's these easy checks that you can cross off to get some cheap applause and hooray for the troops. And then those same comics tend to be like, hey, what's this guy? What are you dating, a Latin? And they tend to do like awful crowd. So I would say that I would say that it's, to me, it feels the same as it's ever been, just like a little more salient on both sides. But it doesn't feel like the Overton window has expanded or moved. It's like maybe expanded or like,
what's the Overton window?
That the like acceptable political discourse shifts toward like one side or another, or
have we talked about how it's interesting that you've got the red pill people on one side and you've got the woke people on the other side, and both of them are, it's implying that you have stepped outside of the matrix and they're like kind of opposite, but they both claim to be like, we've got the truth.
Yeah.
The red pill.
So, I mean, I think that people, either in both of those cases, people are using stereotypes. They're using stereotypes of racist people, and racists are using stereotypes of ethnics or whatever.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. I think that it, and like the cancel culture stuff, Ramin and I often say, it's like, it's not really the thing that happens. Is like a lot of times those people end up doing better with their career because it's billed as like whoa, this is too edgy, and like censorship tape over their mouth and their album cover or whatever.
You lose some audience and you gain a different section of people, I guess.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that I think stereotypes aren't going away anytime soon, but they can be useful tools for building an expectation and then flipping it for comedians as well, because most of what comics are doing is the alien anthropology thing, where you're stepping outside of yourself and like, okay, if this is my first day on Earth and I wasn't aware with like, these are the colors of the sports team you're supposed to like or whatever, how silly would this look? And then you kind of comment on that. And so there's easy ways to, knowing the stereotypes that are in people's minds, you can lead them down that path and then easily kind of like flip it to get that kind of surprise and twist.
Also, the stereotypes are acceptable, I feel like, if you are of that, if you're that color, if you're that gender, if you are that religion, then you can kind of bash it. And if it's clear that you are, in it. But if you're doing it to other groups, then it gets kind of...
My jokes making fun of bearded people have gone over a lot better in the last year.
So, you grew the beard for the jokes, understood.
Yeah.
So actually, I mean, it's kind of an interesting question for me, which is, you say kind of build up to the stereotypes, that people have. How different are your sets if you're giving it, say, as part of stand-up science in Madison, Wisconsin? There's your audience versus, you're giving it in a different part of Wisconsin. I've only ever seen sets in Madison, Wisconsin. So, how different are they?
Ramin, do you want to take that? I mean, I have plenty to say on the subject.
Oh yeah, I thought that was more of a you question for having done more of the stand-up sciences. But I'll say for sure you tweak it as much as you can, and this applies to everything. Whether it's you're doing a corporate set where you're not allowed to use curse words, of course, or if you're doing a college, and if it's, let's say it's an all-girls dorm, like you're maybe gonna not do as much of the like stuff that you think would be more male oriented, but at the end you still have to do your set. You're still you. You can't just throw out your jokes or your persona. But yeah, I found with doing stand-up science sets, like you kind of you feel like the audience is going to get more of the smarter stuff. Or if you like bring up Terence McKenna or Alan Watts or Marie Curie, as opposed to bringing it up in Abilene, Texas, in a steakhouse show or something, you're probably not going to bring up these characters. You have a bias of like, these people aren't going to know these references. So you kind of feel like you can pretend to be smarter.
I spent a ton of time on the road, and I used to quite stubbornly, I started in Boston, and my home club was in Harvard Square. This is like hipster indie club, but I did tons of like Elks Lodges and stuff too, and I really took a great deal of pride in the first part of my career as being kind of like this hybrid comic, and so I wouldn't deviate too much. I could always have a little more fun with the more comedy savvy audiences and push it a little bit more. And, but it was always just as fun for me to like figure out a way of making that stuff work in an audience that, where it was more challenging. And then about 5 years ago, I kind of abandoned that idea too, because it was, so I did a special called Mating Season, which was like my last attempt at that. And that was like, so it was like, hey, I'm going to talk about evolution in a fun way, so I can like talk about it in Texas and stuff, and it will still be palatable. And it was fine for live performing, but as a special, it ended up, when you're talking about like stereotypes or whatever, or alienating people, it was interesting because it alienated both sides. It had, it was the evolution alienated creationists, and then talking about like biological gender role stuff alienated liberals. And then,
try to please everyone, you please nobody.
Yeah, don't serve warm tea, as Peter McGraw would say. And
that's a nice little one there.
Yeah, and so I have since, as you've seen, Sean, started developing these indie shows where I'm like, this is for a very specific audience. Now, rather than like, hey, we're at a comedy club, and hopefully some people know Shane Mauss, but a lot of people are like, comedy, that sounds fun. Now I'm like, all right, this is an indie show, and hopefully some people know Shane Mauss, but they're like, oh, a science and comedy show? That's very different. I'll go and see that. And so, of course, it's going to be, a very, very different clientele. And that actually allows me to spread my wings like quite a bit more.
Have you guys seen what Fred Armisen has done with like that one special called Stand Up for Drummers? And in order to get into the show, they've got like a little snare drum or a practice pad, and like they give you 2 sticks, and you have to like demonstrate that you're at least somewhat of a drummer. And they're like, all right, you can come in. And then the jokes are all extremely specific. Like, you ever go into Sam Ash, and then the guy's sitting there by the toms and blah, blah, and it's just killing it. And he does another one that's for guitarists, but just the psychology
so
behind, specialization. Like if you're selling a glove, and if it's an all-purpose glove, maybe it might not be seen as special. If this glove is for just picking tulips, and it's the best tulip picking glove in the world.
And I realized, like, I'm trying so hard to be like, well, let's see if I can get people to learn something unexpectedly during a comedy show. And some people are just tired with work and whatnot.
Yeah.
And it occurred to me, it's just a blind spot that I had for a while. I think good comics are pretty self-aware and pretty self-critical and decent at detecting their blind spots and correcting course, and usually look back at everything that they made and they're like, gosh, I'm so much better now, hopefully.
Or as you're telling the joke, you're like, this might tank, even though it didn't tank the last 100 times, but strap in. Got to have a thing to do in case, it worked? Okay, great. That means I can keep talking to...
Exactly.
Yeah, there's a little judgmental thing going on as you're supposedly in the present.
Yeah, but it's not, and for me, it hasn't even been just like, oh, look at how smart these jokes are. It's just like if someone wanted to do like Fred, a set all about drums or a set all about football or whatever. I think that's terrific if you're a football fan. But if I went to a comedy show and the headliner just talked about football for an hour, even if it was funny, I'd be like, I wish that wouldn't have happened, or I would have been given a heads up about that. That's great for an audience that wants it, but you got to tell people.
It's something comics talk about a lot, about how music is very genre separated, and like no one would say, oh, let's go out and watch music. It's like, no, we're going to this one specific prog metal show or whatever. Whereas comedy, there's no categories. It's like, let's see comic, and it could be the most filthy thing you've ever imagined, or it can be the most clean thing, and you just don't know going in. Most of the time, people just show up.
And people, if they see one, this is why this is part of the why the business is so hard. People usually go and see one comedy show ever, and if they don't like that, they don't go, well, maybe I'll like the next one that I go to. They just are like, I guess I don't enjoy live comedy, which no one would do that with music or video games for that matter.
Yeah, because it's all your data points.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of last area in social psych, and I think we'll change decision making. So there's lots of topics in social psych, basically how people behave in groups. And in big groups, often people behave badly, particularly when they have, role models for other people behaving badly. So I guess, what are the cases where you've seen crowds acting badly? I mean, obviously anything that leads to lowered inhibition. So drinking is an obvious one, but things that'll make people more aggressive are things like, is it too hot? Is it too crowded? Those things will make people aggressive. If it's very dark and they feel anonymous, often they'll feel, so what are your experience with poorly performing or poorly behaving groups of individuals?
The darkness thing is a huge one. And the comedian Todd Glass always is so particular about set and setting with comedy shows. Like you have to have the lights dim so that people don't see your face, so you feel like you're more free to laugh at stuff that you otherwise wouldn't have laughed at if people can see that you're laughing at it. Be a little closer to people. I know in the COVID days, who knows when that's coming back, but you want to be kind of squeezed together, not have too much personal space, because then you're a little more tense, boxed in. Low ceilings so it can resonate throughout it, but
poor ventilation, basically everything bad for COVID. No, not poor ventilation. But.
But with the people behaving in groups, like one thing in particular is, let's say you've got a heckler and they shout out something and it lands and you don't have a thing to get them back with. If they've like kind of dominated that, like I feel like there will be a huge shift in the mood of the room, like with a pack of wolves or something. Like you never show weakness, and like if it's shown that you were nipped at by the other wolf, you are no longer the alpha in that situation. You're the faith in you kind of drops, I feel like. Would you agree?
And similarly, there's Ramin and I, because we aren't serving warm tea, we're bound, maybe me more than Ramin, but I'm definitely bound to like walk a table. Like every show, I look at that as an indicator of being successful. If you don't want to walk everybody, but
I've
if you
walked tables,
if you don't walk anybody, it's like a little bit serving warm tea, like it might be palatable, but it probably won't be memorable. And there's something, so our style will maybe tend to lend itself to, some people are laughing harder because they know other people aren't getting it. So they're like in on it. Or that was too taboo or something. Like I went and saw the Book of Mormon in Schenectady, New York, and it was in this theater. Yeah.
What's it called?
The Book of Mormon?
No, Schenectady.
Schenectady.
I know that's wasting time on the podcast, but I mean, I couldn't just listen to a
Schenectady.
word called Schenectady and be like, that's
I'm most
a place.
upset that you made it made me repeat it because I'm probably saying it wrong, and I was hoping you were going to let it float right by rather than put
Never.
the pressure
Not
on.
once.
Do I have to read out loud too? No.
Okay, so go on. You saw Book of Mormon and
the South Park musical. It's exceptionally. It's pushing boundaries even for my tastes in, I think, really well done ways. But it's really approaching some real lines. But I saw it, and like a ton of people were just. A ton of attendees were people with theater passes. And so it was like a bunch of blue hairs and stuff like that had no idea what they were walking into. And it made it so much funnier. And everyone that was there knew what they were getting. Like, it was so much funnier because of that. And so that's one side of it. And then the opposite side of the coin is what Ramin and I, when I was talking about kind of the cookie cutter headliner in a box, we sometimes call them, or like you just like go and get the cheap applause and you just like get people whipped. It's not necessarily that it's like a group of dumb individuals walked into the room. It's that, like, as a collective, there are devices you can use to pander to like lower hanging fruit and kind of get people whipped up and excited and do like kind of cheap crowd work stuff that's like a bunch of like cheap tricks and gets people real energized, but also like dumbed down at the same time. And then I get on stage and follow that, and it's like it's a classic example of it's like exceptionally difficult for people that are unique to follow like really strong, abrasive, hacky comedians.
Yeah, it's like food pairings. Like there is an order in which you can serve food, which would not like help the next course. Like, I'm struggling for examples right now in my head, but some things pair well with others. And yeah, sometimes a very strong hack can go up first, and then it's just the worst thing that could have prepped you for your set, which is why so many comics like are particular about who they bring on the road as their opener.
Yeah, you don't want to follow Donald Trump, and it's not because you're dumber than him. And so there's that, and then there's also just I have, as I've been doing indie shows more and more, I've been taking the other comics out of shows. It's like, well, I'm doing a show about psychedelics, and every time I have an opener in a given city, like, I just need them to do 10 or 15 minutes of what they do everywhere else. Instead, they're sifting through their notebook trying to come up with some dumb drug joke that is like just reminding the audience that I'm not on stage. And it's also priming people to be like, oh, is this going to be a bunch of like dumb I got high and lost my car keys kind of show? And it just set the wrong tone for me. And so I have an easier time just doing I'd just rather be on stage for another 30 minutes and not have to sit in the back of the room terrified that the opener is like ruining everything for me. So there's that, and then there's just like there's the idea of like the customer always being right doesn't hold true at all in comedy. So there's like good security, not just having like some tough guy there for if someone starts throwing bottles. That's not what happens. I just mean in terms of some clubs will have like videos ahead of time that are like, hey, make sure and put your phones away and remember to do these things and keep your table talk down to a minimum. And some people have a bouncer, like if a table's getting too loud, which is a much bigger problem than hecklers. Hecklers happens once in a while. People breaking off, like even liking a joke, but then breaking off and telling their own little story and not realizing
that happened
how
to us last week. Remember the other week?
Exactly. That seems to be a much bigger issue, and different clubs are better at dealing with it. Like one of my favorite people is this like a really likable guy. He'll come by and he's like, "Oh, geez, hey, they're recording this for an album right now. These mics, they pick up everything." So, and then it has that table be like, "Oh my gosh, we didn't realize." Whereas if the bouncer comes up and it's like, "Hey, can you guys keep it down a little bit? You heard the rules." Then they're like, "What? Were we laughing too hard? I guess you're not allowed to laugh at a comedy show." And you're getting like the 1-star Yelp review. They're only getting louder. There's things like that happens. And then say that there's a room under normal conditions where it's a Wednesday night. The club packs out on the weekends, but it's a Wednesday night. It's the lighter, like, hashing stuff out night, and like it's going to be a quarter capacity. Well, if you just let people seat themselves, they're going to naturally be like, "Oh, I'm going to sit in the back and like comfortably enjoy this show." Very few people are going to naturally sit themselves and pack themselves to the front of the room. And even though the show will be better if they do that. And
empty front row is death. You never want to have an empty front row.
Empty front row is absolute death. And then additionally, there is the people that volunteer to sit up front are always the last people that you actually want sitting up front, because they want the whole show to be about I hope they tell jokes about us and that sort of thing. So there's a million little nuanced subconscious primes like that. Some clubs show like fun videos ahead of time. I usually just show like chill, like Animal Planet stuff with Pink Floyd playing or something like that ahead of time, because it's like, it's a little bit like smart and fun and interesting to watch, and it's kind of compelling and it's engaging, but it's not like, now I'm not following like a bunch of like Jackass videos or whatever. It's like, well, I can't follow Steve-O putting himself in the porta potty slingshot, and now I'm gonna tell like like science jokes or whatever. So there's so much.
Yeah, the shift in like, playing the Animal Planet, Pink Floyd, whatever music, and then have people talking amongst themselves, and then you dim the music and then dim the light, so it creates like, oh, now it's a different world than where we just were. Whereas if there wasn't any music and you just interrupted talking of silence, then it's kind of weird.
And then when you're the headliner at so many clubs, some clubs do this right and correct it and drop the checks afterwards. But when you're the headliner, you're killing. It's been a great show. Everyone's had so much fun. And then there's 15 minutes left. You're getting ready for your big closer. This is the grand finale. You've been building toward this moment. And then they drop the checks at that time, and people start doing math and talking about how they're splitting the bill. And now
pulling out their phone, looking at it with the phone light.
And so there's just so many little things that your average person would never pick up on. Just like any job. I have a brother-in-law that installs windows. I was maybe going to get an RV. He's like, "Don't do that. The windows in those things, they cost like $7,000 to replace if you get a little chip in it." Oh, didn't know, wouldn't know, So there's just endless things like that with comedy that you would never think of.
If you're living in an RV, like the chipped windows is your least problem. Or it's fine to live in an RV. I don't know what the point of that joke was.
So before we discuss stereotypes of people who live in RVs, maybe we'll switch to decision making. I know this is an interest of yours, Shane, some of the cognitive biases. These are ones I'd imagine you'd have to get good at basically undoing. They're kind of biases people have. So for instance, sunk cost fallacy, people know is, throwing good money after bad. If you had a case where, you think this is funny and you cannot get it to work, and you just go after it and go after it and go after it, even after time would say, I should quit this. Endowment effect. You tend to value things more if they belong to you. So I think this is funny because I came up with it, but if I heard someone else say it, and the last one, like you talked about, is risk aversion. people tend to prefer sure things to risky things. We don't love taking risks. But if you're, somewhere high impact, you're somewhere where this could make a big difference in your career. How do you evaluate risk? Do you tell the thing that's low risk and is going to land, or the higher risk thing that might bomb or might really shoot you up in the air?
Low risk during high stakes. If it's an industry showcase and you're trying to get on, a late night thing or Netflix people, like, you don't do any new material, not a word of it.
I disagree.
You do all new? Interesting.
Not all new. I go high risk. I
high
always,
risk. Interesting.
I always do the higher risk stuff. I perform better when I get like a little adrenaline rush. When I did my Comedy Central Presents, I did like a few jokes that I had never. That's
different. That's the actual taping. I'm talking like the opportunity to get that taping.
Oh yeah, well,
your audition versus your performance.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like every time I played it safe on auditions, it hasn't worked out that well for me. I once was with so I had already done Conan 3 times or something like that, or 4 times, and I'm in New York. And they had me host a Conan audition show, like how they're going to pick upcoming guests. And the 2 people that took the biggest risks, one was Rory Scovel, who went on stage, did like a Southern character voice, like a ridiculous, effeminate Southern character voice through his whole set, without breaking character or telling people he was doing a character or anything else, never alluded to it, and closed his set and everything and left without ever changing that
wasn't
voice.
The first time he did that, though, because I've seen him do that. That's a tried and true for him, though, isn't it?
Not back then.
I wasn't there for it. Oh, okay. So he was working out the newer
and he
then.
hadn't been on late night,
Oh, okay.
He hadn't, and no one in the room knew he was doing a character, and the booker didn't know he was doing a character, and he was like, and he wasn't like doing it in a Southern. It was just, yeah. And then the other one was Reggie Watts just blew his time by. I couldn't even believe it. And I was like, well, that's 2 ways to not get on Conan.
Reggie is such an exception, because I mean, I opened for Reggie like a string of 4 shows one time, and I don't think he repeated himself once during those 4 sets. Like it was just off the dome, looping things. But I guess, yeah, it's 2 different philosophies. I think of it like, don't they say Floyd Mayweather is, his fights are boring? I haven't watched it, but I hear that he's not taking risk. He's like playing it very safe, and it's overall a boring fight as far as fights go, but it's consistent, and that he's not going to take a risk to have something flashy happen. It's like very guarded and conservative moves.
So when I was like really hungry as a younger comedian, I used to always take the biggest risks on the most. So the biggest problem with the road is, over time, you're like, well, you don't want to alienate people because then you're not going to get booked there again. And you now depend on that income, so you can't take the same chances you could at an open mic early on. I always disregarded all of that early on, and I was like, nope, this is my workshop for like the big stage. And once I stopped doing that, it hindered my act a little bit. But yeah, I mean, that's sometimes you just want to like get through a show, and so you're like, these jokes will work, and that's good enough. So that's risk aversion. Let's maybe do some sunk cost stuff, Ramin. You got any sunk costs? I mean,
maybe a joke that worked the first 3 times and then never worked again. That could be kind of a sunk cost one, because it worked 3 times and you've already invested yourself. That has both, maybe more of the you came up with it, so it's golden, and you'll there's another thing I wanted to say about risk aversion, though. Sure. And how the biggest risk is that first open mic, because it's everyone's biggest fear, bigger than death, is public speaking, especially in a stand-up setting, and it takes a huge leap to go from not being a comic at all to signing up for an open mic, doing it, and feeling that new sensation of, oh, this is even worse than I thought it'd be. I didn't anticipate this type of stomach feeling or this type of throat closing up thing. And then after you get past that, it's rare that you ever take that big of a risk again. Like so many comics never go up and try a fully new set again. And I know I just said that I play it safe a lot of the time, but yeah, it's like that first risk never happens again almost. You get comfortable in your set and your style and where you do shows and so on.
Yeah, and that's you kind of shift gears in your career or whatever. Or I have many times as a stand-up, and Ramin has just in terms of the where he puts his energy more, but also it's like once the next thing is once you decide to go full time as a comedian, that's another big leap for most people, unless you just like you just got like you're the new Tony Stark in this new movie, and so you have no. But that's usually when you go from part-time comedian to full-time comedian, it's because you're just making just enough now to go full-time, and so there's a lot of risk there. So I'm glad that you noticed that too, about the sunk cost and the endowment effect kind of running in unison-ish or kind of a bit of a confound there with a lot of things, because definitely now, I mean, the older I get, I'm just so not attached to ideas like I used to be. But early on, definitely, like, my jokes were my babies. They were so very precious to me. And like, screw you if you don't like it, it doesn't matter. You're hearing it anyway. And
some people get too attached to the ideas to where it's not even the joke that they're possessive of, but the topic. And not to throw people under the bus, because I think he's a really good comic, and I just thought this was one weird interaction I had with him, but I had some kind of joke about, I don't know what it was, bulletproof vests or something like that, and I was opening for Judah Friedlander, and he like kind of brought me aside in the green room. He's like, hey bud, yeah, just so you know, I've got a bulletproof vest joke that's yeah, so you probably don't want to do that one. And then later on I'm listening to it, I'm like, it has nothing to do with it. Like, it's the only thing that's similar is the item in it, not anything related to it. But whatever, I don't want to stir the pot of feathers, but I thought it was weird that, damn, you're possessive of even a word.
He's the world champion of hoarding jokes.
Yeah.
So Judah is great. I've opened for him as well.
Next question. I've opened for him as well. I did better. Next question.
Was that an impression of me? Is that what I
No,
sound
that's
like?
of Judah.
Oh.
No, Judah, because Judah says like, yeah, next question. Yeah. I got kicked out of China because I was too good at karate. Next question.
So I feel like Ramin brings up that awesome. I wonder if you find anything interesting about that, Shawn, where that's a very common thing happens, where you think of this grand idea on the way to the club for the show, and you're just so excited, and you try out this joke, and it just crushes. And you call like your girlfriend, and like, wow, I just got my new closer for the late night show, and like you're just like, I got my new favorite joke, and let's see, how do I'll start getting some merch together for this or whatever.
That's what I'm talking about. Sure.
and then you tell it a few more times, and it just slowly gets a worse and worse reaction, and you find out that, oh, it wasn't so much the joke as your enthusiasm that you brought to the table there, or you just can't replicate that same delivery you had, or whatever it is. This happens quite a bit to comics, and now you like stubbornly like stick with it because you're like, but I know it can work. I've seen it work. Why won't it work anymore? So that's
and
a thing.
Sunk cost can be with the order too. Like if your jerk order is in a particular way, and maybe you have, a stuff about car engines in the beginning, and then you have another car engine joke in the end, and you're like, oh, I could kind of merge those into one bit, but in your head, you've already like invested time in making the order this way, and you don't want to have to like memorize a new order of jokes. So it's like, no, it's fine the way it is.
Oh,
It costs
man.
too much time to
As you say
reconfigure the
that,
order.
Yeah, and it's also, that's the thing that no audience is ever going to appreciate. Like I guess you gotta see this show again to see this Christopher Nolan like web of twists and turns and surprise beautiful ending that I did. Like, why didn't I get a standing ovation right now? Don't they understand how I connected this to this to this to this?
Yeah.
Is a thing. Which also that I saw another thing in the document that you sent me, Sean, that this I don't know if maybe this was something coming up that you're going to ask us about, or maybe you decided to ask us other questions, but the idea of like kind of blaming the audience for things, was that related to, did we already kind of discuss the topic?
So we haven't quite hit that. I mean, yes, I mean, that would fall under, cognitive dissonance when you're trying, it's like you have belief in yourself as someone who's funny, or belief in this joke as something that's funny. And then you have counter evidence, right, that basically can't square. And anytime we have things that can't square, it makes us uncomfortable, right, which we call cognitive dissonance. And so you have to relieve it in some way. You either have to think that the fault is the audience or the fault is your joke, right? And it's a case where, it seems like learning to resolve cognitive dissonance in the right way would be really important as a comedian, because it's very natural to kind of try to preserve self-esteem, to resolve it as in it's their fault. On the other hand, if you're going to be successful, that's probably not going to be a useful strategy for resolving that particular dissonance, because it won't change your behavior.
Yeah.
Yeah,
blaming the, or go ahead, actually.
I took a comedy class when I first started. I did a set first at a club, and then they're like, well, it's like a paid club, and I didn't know how open mics work or whatever. They're like, so you really gotta like work stuff out first ahead of time and whatnot, and like nice about it and everything, but it's like, okay, I'll take a $200 comedy class at this tech school or whatever, and this comic, Rich Gustus, that taught it. He had this joke that was like, it was something to the effect of, the audience can be just like the most amazing. It can be like a bunch of like cancer researchers or something like that in the audience, but if they don't laugh at your jokes, you're like, oh, those people suck, what's wrong with them? And then but then you can like be performing to just some group of like horrible like Wall Street like hedge fund managers or whatever, and if they like all of your jokes, you're like, wow, but those people really get me. Those are some fine people with good values. It
reminds me of this quote, like to make a little music metaphor or analogy or whatever. This quote that says, a bad musician blames their instrument. A good musician makes instruments out of everything. So like you could say like, it's my stupid guitar, like this fret is flat, blah, blah, the pickup's not right. But someone that really knows what they're doing, we've all seen homeless, street performers that have like the lowest end instrument with just one string on it made out of a rubber band, and they're making something really cool sounding, or just banging on a pot. And the same goes with audiences. And I remember one night where everybody was just eating it. Nobody could get through with anything. Not the 10-year veterans, not the 15-year veterans, not the young up-and-comers. Like their A material wasn't working, their crowd work wasn't working. And then Ron White did a drop-in set, and part of his success could have been his, his fame. People knew who he was, but I think it was more that his confidence of just addressing it, and he completely turned the room around. It went from the deadest night in the whole year to being the most electric. Everybody's howling. The mood shifted just through his knowing what to do with that scenario that the rest of us were like kind of holding our heads up or hands up in the air.
Yeah, that's the other that's part of much of comedy. Like a lot of my early stuff was intentionally building tension in a room and then releasing it, having that twist. It's like, oh, okay, that was it.
I was only pretending to bomb for 50 minutes.
And
here's the real me.
I did a lot of like I kind of played up like a aw shucks Midwesterner stuff, like a little bit of like the Sarah Silverman kind of like, tee hee, is this me telling like this horribly offensive joke?
Diarrhea.
I did a little bit of that.
Why does it look different? Yeah.
Really early on.
Probably not a joke.
That's probably not a joke. But yeah, it depends on how self-aware the comedian is. So anyway, if it always helps to like address if the show hasn't been going well or if it's not going well, the comedian should be able to like address that and put some spin on it or whatever. And then there's people that have some friends of mine call them laugh ears, where like they get on stage, they bomb so bad, and then they get off stage and like, that was great to like the other comics, and everyone saw what they just did. And it's like, what? And then there's comedians like Dave Attell will get on stage, absolutely destroy the place, and get off stage and be like, God, I suck so bad at everything.
I suck. Those midgets jokes are the worst. The same dick joke.
And so, you know, there's the less self-aware comics are going to tend to be the like whip the audience into a frenzy kind of stuff, and then the more hyper self-aware ones are going to be like the artistes who are like way too critical of themselves. So there's individual differences there, and then there's like a case-by-case basis of there are times when you simply do need to blame the conditions. You know, if you told this joke 20 times and it didn't work ever, like, okay, but if this joke works 99 times out of 100, and then you're in a showroom and like someone dropped a tray of drinks like right at the punchline, and then there was like this crowd of assholes or like this table of assholes or whatever happened, and like someone had to be thrown out, like you have to be like, well, that one sucked and that wasn't my fault, that was just the universe.
It is like magic in a way, where like if you're looking away from the magician for a couple seconds and then you look back and then the trick is completed, like you're not going to be impressed as the same as you were watching the whole time. The slightest distraction can throw you off the rails. Mm-hmm. And nothing is worse to an audience than not acknowledging the elephant in the room. If you just keep plowing through with your material and something huge happened that just needs to be addressed for 3 seconds, like that's
they
death.
Actually love when stuff goes wrong. Like, yeah, you can be doing really well on stage and you like flubbing and saying the wrong words or whatever is like, that's the highlight of the show. But and part of it's like a release of tension thing too, like laughing, like, that's okay, we understand. And
if it goes too well, they think it's a plant. Like if you are interacting with someone in the audience and the banter is just particularly good for that moment, they're like, is that someone you planted in there to do that?
Also, doing well and getting laughs doesn't mean it's good. I learned from my first album, I put a joke on that never worked in front of any audience, and was like a highlight of my album, that like anyone that reviewed it was like, check out this joke. And it's because it was a joke that made people incredibly like uncomfortable when they're packed into a room, but when they're just in a car by themselves and allowed to laugh at whatever they see fit, they loved it. and so there's just so many different factors. Like it's like the you look at Rotten Tomatoes and there's like the critics. I'm going to, the critics score really high and the audience score is kind of low. I'm going to be like, okay, well, is this like celebration of whatever culturally we're celebrating right now, or is it because it's like so sophisticated and weird that it was like because if it's sophisticated and weird, like I'm going to trust that critic score over the audience score. Whereas like if I'm picking something out for my parents to watch or something, I'm going to be like, okay, this has a good audience score and a low critic score. Okay, this is like cookie cutter enough to like be a satisfying formulaic show that they're going to like. There'll be some explosions and stuff. Terrific. They're going to like that.
So big part of intro psych is mental health. So we talk about clinical disorders. And so one topic I'd be interested in your thoughts on. So, we spend a lot of time talking about stigmas around mental health and why people don't seek help for mental health. And there are certain professions where that's disproportionately the case. So often, say military personnel or athletes, have this sense of being that involves being strong. And they've got this stereotype that having mental health issues is a weakness. So they don't seek mental health. I can imagine the case of comedy, part of oneself is being gregarious and being funny, in which case things like anxiety or depression might be a threat to self. So I guess, what have you seen in kind of the world of comedy with respect to mental health, people seeking help when they need help, failing to seek help when they need help?
I think most comics actually do go to a therapist unless they can't afford it. But that's an overgeneralization, but less so than I would assume the military or athletes. I think there's less of the aggro machismo to it. And this might just be anecdotal because I'm thinking of so many comics that have jokes about talking to their therapist and like, oh, it's bad when your therapist doesn't answer your calls on your birthday or whatever. That's not. How many times did I say a thing and then I have to immediately after be like, that doesn't count. That's not an actual joke that I tried to make. But I don't know. I haven't gone to a therapist, but lots of comedians, I feel like, and not even specific to gender or anything. I feel like both men, women, non-binary, and genderless people are going to therapy in comedy until they run out of credit card funds.
Yeah, it's a bit of a hot topic right now, and it's kind of on the other side, the kind of comic book or whatever, like more liberal, more comedy savvy, more alternative kind of side of comedy tends to that's the big thing. Like Nanette was this wildly popular Netflix special recently that was like very vulnerable and like think I'm gonna get a quick comedy and here's why, and like I was raped and all these things, and like this really heavy stuff, so much so that there was many people that were like, this isn't comedy, where are the punchlines? Those people are now making a name for themselves doing rants about ethnics, but so this is like a little more maybe psychology 102, but I actually think that there's something really interesting going on, which is that, comedians, what people are liking about a comedy show is a lot of people feel these frustrations in life or whatever, and don't have an opportunity to express them. They go from their office job where everyone is expected to be a cheerleader, and if you aren't, HR is going to come and talk to you, to home where you're like watching what you say around the kids or whatever else, and then you go to like church, or you go to have your like card club and it's a social situation, and comedians get to just like say their most vulnerable things, right? And so audience responds to that. But then there's something pretty interesting that happens after that. This is like that 102, more complex. I don't know how you would necessarily test such a thing, which is that.
How about through some sort of shocking thing where people can hold it and it shocks them? That's what psychology is all about, right? Shocking people when they don't know it. Yeah.
But the idea of I like thinking about ideas a lot. I like tracking when I come up with like good jokes and when I don't, what environment that I'm in. Like I often would like arriving to the club early and not sitting in the green room, but sitting in the back of the show and watching people come in and like looking at their faces and stuff. And because it starts cueing, like I can just imagine myself on stage better, and it would help me like figure out the order more. And like, yeah, I think I will try out this new joke, or like, oh, this thing I was very excited about in the car, I'm not sure I have it in me just yet. And within that, so there's this thing that happens, I think, which is you start, hey, I'm going to be a stand-up comedian. So there's this idea that like stand-ups are all these sad clowns or whatever, but I don't think it's that sad clowns necessarily get into comedy. I think that and
clowns have some level of training too.
Yeah. Clowns have a skill. You go, I want to be a comedian. What a fun job. All right, I'll take the stand-up class. Okay, this is how you build an expectation, this rule of 3. You set the thing up, and then you use the second example to reinforce it, and then you throw in that dick joke to surprise them at the end. And you learn those things, and you figure out how to get laughs, and you start kind of feeling more comfortable on stage. And then one day you have a bad day, and you get on stage and you feel comfortable enough to vent or improvise or whatever, and you go like, man, I was terrible in the bedroom last night, and then I get outside and my neighbor yelled at me for my dog being in his yard or whatever, and you vent, and it's not even, you don't even have that many jokes. Maybe it's like kind of funny what you're saying, but the audience goes crazy, and like the energy of it you've never felt before, and it's because it's so genuine and honest, and there's and they can tell that it's real, and everyone has a neighbor like that, and then then this, speaking of like Pavlovian conditioning that you were trying to avoid, I do think that then you recognize like, oh, that show went better than that was a special kind of energy. What happened there? And like, oh, what other vulnerable little aspects could I share about myself? And then you do start kind of Pavlovian training this like, oh, every time I reveal this dark little secret of mine, I get rewarded for it. And once you start being paid to do that, and now your job is to like expose all of the times that you've been a fuck up in life. And then additionally, you might also be a little more prone to get yourself into trouble because like if the audience member that's drinking with me tonight does like 5 shots and is late for work tomorrow morning, that's terrible for him. If I do a bunch of shots and miss my flight and everything else, that's my next 10-minute bit, you know? So there's
a lot of comics that also are afraid to even become more mentally healthy because they think that they're going to lose their magic power, then their suffering and their imbalance might actually be the source of a lot of their funny. And most of the time, that's probably not true. Sometimes it is, like, you know, when Patton Oswalt gets married or something, it's like, oh, I'm not going to be funny anymore because I'm happy, and happiness is the death of comedy. But back to the mental, I mean, we were talking about mental health this whole time, but the stigma of the mental health, I feel like over the last decade, it's been a like kind of steady decline, maybe partially due to, like, you know, Robin Williams hung himself, Brody Stevens, Richard Bain, like a lot of, every time a comic, whether they're super notable or just mid-level notable happens, I always hear this, you know, narrative of, well, we have to actually seriously start talking about mental health, and this person was having this struggle, and before it just wasn't brought up. Like someone hanging themselves was seen as not a prominent thing that could happen to someone you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think just I've seen way more of it in my I guess let's see, I started comedy in 2004. Yeah, I guess it's like 17 years this month, and I would say that there's been a pretty big shift in that from the beginning. Comics were always a little more toward the vulnerable side, but I think just culturally there's less pull up your bootstrap type stuff. So yeah, I don't know. I almost worry it's going the other way where, like Ramin said, some comics are worried about, like, I can't take care of myself, I'll lose my funny. I'll
lose 4 minutes of material. Have you heard Emily Heller's bit about if you're ever considering going to therapy, just tell your friends that you've started going to therapy and watch their reaction? And I thought there was a great truth there where none of them are going to be like, no, what do you mean, you? Therapy? What are you doing? They're all like, oh, thank God. I no longer have to bear the brunt of this.
Yeah, I also think that there was like the 80s when it was like, Sam Kinison does a reel of cocaine, and then like Def Leppard throws a thing out the hotel window, and that's what being a celebrity is like. And then,
the 80s pre-AIDS, mid-coke 80s excess period.
And this is like, it's been leaning into I at least thought it was leaning into the era of like vulnerability and being more authentic and genuine. So my hope is that people are going to be addressing mental health stuff more and more. Even the bro comedy stuff that irritates me of like red pill stuff is like, well, you got to do a bunch of push-ups and be disciplined and stuff. So it's like gone are the days of just celebrating like the cocaine drunken raves and stuff like that all of the time.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess last one, because I know we're running on time here. It's one that's near and dear to me, which is human learning. I teach students, and they have a tendency to try to study by reading and rereading textbooks, for instance. Right? They read the textbook and they read it again, Human beings just aren't really built to learn particularly well that way. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, how you learn to do a show that's 45 minutes, an hour, where presumably you can't wing the whole thing. You have to have lots of stuff memorized. So, how do you actually go about, doing that? And, what are the things that you actually attempt to have down pat? So, a topic that dovetails in there is that, we use more than just spoken words to infer, say, emotion or communication. We use facial expressions, postures, movements. So how much when you're practicing are you sitting down or, trying to do the full set of behaviors that you're going to be doing?
I think it varies per person. So I know these are going to be individual answers. We probably don't have complete overlap here, but it's definitely not a width before depth thing where if you're doing an hour, it's rare that you have a skeleton for the whole hour and then decide I'm going to make this hour. For me, at least, it's slowly built through jokes that work and stand the test of time. And then you kind of shed stuff that doesn't work throughout time. And you try to get to like 90 minutes and then you cut that hour, or you cut 30 minutes out of that hour that is the weakest, so that it's just that perfect hour. And yeah, and it doesn't seem like a lot, but it can take more than a year to get a good hour, if not more than that. And I guess, yeah, you build it very, very slowly based on what works and then arrange it as it goes. So in doing it, you're building it as you perform it. But there's some people that do it differently. Some people write it out and have a big idea of what they want to make.
I've done all the things. When I started, that was exactly my style of like just all right, trying out these jokes. Okay, this one worked. All right, these are the funniest things. And then I'll put it together in this like kind of cohesive order, or like this is an A joke, this is a B joke, this is an A joke, this is a B joke. And
Also, Shane, you've put out what, 5 albums?
No, just 3, but then
Okay, you put
I've
out
toured
3
with
albums
shows and stuff too.
and a special. But I'm trying to
Yeah.
make the point that you've created, I don't know, at least 6, 7 full hours, and I've over my stand-up career, I've created 2 good hours. I feel like.
Yeah, I mean,
you've done more making of those.
yeah, I don't draw or play instruments or any of the other things. I was very prolific when I started. I was known for that. I don't always feel that way anymore, but I don't care about comedy as much as I used to. But I used to kind of like what Ramin said. But I used to practice in front of the mirror, and I used to practice in my car all of the time. My first probably 3 years of doing comedy, at least, if not more, probably first 5 years. And I always thought that rehearsing in front of a mirror was much better than performing in front of an audience, because I thought audiences only made me deviate from the plan, and audiences only screwed up my timing. And whereas like what I did in front of the mirror was what would be on TV, whereas like when you're in the Elks Lodge, you have to make adjustments, and now you're rushing through the joke, and now it comes off as not as confident, so I used to like listen back and time out everything and cut out words, and I make sure there was 4 jokes in a minute, and I would like rate the level of the jokes there. I had like a very kind of mathematical approach, and then I started building long form stuff over time, and that's like I'll have a show when COVID's over. I'll have probably multiple shows just ready to go. I'll need to change some things, but they'll be ready to go, and they'll be pretty good because I have like a sense of how like what jokes will. It takes me time to like I'm still not happy with this before I'll present it, but I feel like I used to be like, well, here's a bunch of spaghetti thrown against the wall. This seems to work. And now I'm like, oh, this'll work. And then there's some unexpected things that happen, and I change it a little bit. But one thing that I think is especially applicable to anybody. So I have a science podcast. I think that I know my way around science concepts pretty well for the education that I had, which I never went to college. I was like a factory worker. I was wild alcoholic for the longest time. And I wouldn't say I take a lot of classes. I listen to audiobooks and do read, but I wouldn't say I'm the biggest reader in the world. And I would say like more than anything, the way my ability to retain concepts, it's not like IQ or some like special trick that I'm doing. It's just that I have to frame things in a way that I would say them to an audience when I learn something. And when I'm listening to someone talk, I'm mindful of like, okay, well, who would be listening to this right now? And so I'm so much more actively engaged in that. And then I'm kind of remembering it in my own way. And so if you're learning something, if you're thinking about, well, how would I teach this to someone else? How would I share this? I think that's the best. You know, when you read that gem, you're like, oh, I can't wait to share this at a party or whatever and impress people. Those are the things that you're going to understand the best. And then because there's also then incentive, like, you know, you're going to use it. You're not sitting in school like, when am I ever going to use this? You're like, I can't wait to use this in a situation. And so that's I'd say my number one kind of learning trick.
Tomo Fujita says that a teacher is just a really good student. And so you might not just be a person that's carrying around all the knowledge and is ready to throw it. But if someone has a question, you know a way in which to think like a student and be like, oh, interesting. How would we arrive at that conclusion, even though I don't know it right now? But we'll learn it together. And I guess, more experienced at finding the way to arrive at the answer.
Mm-hmm.
So I think those are all the ones I had. It's looking like.
Amazing. We solved both comedy and psychology in 100 minutes. That's incredible. And
mental health has been a really big problem, and it's great to kind of put this behind us and have it fixed now.
Yeah, I think we checked off most of the mysteries of life as well in that time too. So that was just a very productive.
So we even fixed racism in the middle somewhere, and I know a lot of people like have been worried about the rise in
episode.
That. Yeah, so we've got that figured out. We've got it all.
Probably people gonna be bumping up their Patreon tier after this one, feeling guilty for only giving $5 a month for these gems.
Yeah.
So basically, Shawn, you're going to have me come into your class. We had this conversation. You're going to pick out what you thought was the interesting ones. Oh, here's the one where Shane goes off for a little too long and it's not really that interesting. I'll avoid that question. And then we'll kind of do this same sort of thing in your class, and I'll take questions from your students, right?
Yep, for sure. I got 375, and the ones, I've got them written down, the ones that you go on a tangent if I, need to get coffee or, pee or something. I can use those that way too. So
do you do live classes, or it's still locked down?
I do synchronous online on Zoom. So I have 375, boxes with names on it that I teach to twice a week.
Yeah, my brother does that, or not psychology, but he's also a prof.
Are they good boxes? Do you like your boxes mostly?
Yeah, my students are great. And they're very active in chat, so I'm sure they'll have questions, that they'll throw in chat for sure.
Cool.
Fun. I think the interaction with them, and they always have questions that it wouldn't have occurred to me to ask. For better or worse, for sure.
That's terrific. All right. Well, Shawn Green, everybody. Is there anything that you wanted to plug, Shawn? If you guys want to go
Doom
back,
coming out, right?
Yeah. What's the new video game?
Doom Eternal.
Yeah, exactly.
You have any new papers since the last time you're on, or whatever? People maybe check out your website. How do people find you so they don't find the wrong Shawns?
So if you search for C Shawn Green, you will get me. For sure. And I've even, managed to beat out, baseball player Shawn Green.
Nice.
In that.
Whoa, that's science in action.
Yeah. You need the C. Without the C, I'm like 900 Google pages down, but the C will rise me right to the top there.
You get there. We'll see if we can get you to 800 Google pages after this.
Or just Shawn.
And
we can get you the number one Shawn spot.
And RaminNazer.com, who you can also hear each week on our podcast, Mind Under Matter, where we're kind of positioning it like, hey, this is Ramin interviews mystics, I interview scientists, and which is like ultimately a little bit of a false dichotomy. We do have different perspectives, but we just have these blended conversations where often I'm looking at Ramin's art, which are very kind of like
Shane
meta.
Thinks the answer is you think the answer is beakers. I think the answer is crystals.
Yeah, and then I think, well, what would beakers think about this? And then I give Ramin a lecture about beakers from his crystal art, and then he throws some crystals at me, and it's a wonderful back and forth. So check that out. So thanks both of you for joining me on the Here We Are podcast today. And thank you, listeners, for being such wonderful, curious people. And we'll talk with you more next week. All right, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the show. Next week, talking with Scott Barry Kaufman about Transcend, the new science of self-actualization. New kind of Maslow's 2.0 is kind of the idea. We really just go off on all sorts of weird, funny tangents. Talk a lot about being a bad student growing up, and Scott has a really compelling story that I think is as worthwhile to share as his research, and it's something that I resonated with a lot, and I think a lot of people would find a benefit in it. And so yeah, enjoy that. And I want to plug. So been changing tiers around and stuff, adding new perks, and to the Patreon page, Patreon/Shane Mauss. We're now about 3/4 of the way to the goal of having all of the editing expenses. That's just the editing expenses of the show, nothing else. And having that just paid through Patreon. We're done selling ads on the show, and so getting support from people, and that's been awesome. I like that so much more. I would rather you guys go on and give whatever you can, or join a tier and get some of the bonus content on there. Like I just put my the only recording of my Good Trip show, a 97-minute kind of like a bootleg, and you can check that out and entertain, share it with friends. You can download it and have a viewing party or whatever. And then been having a bunch of game nights and stuff like that. But within that, we put a super high, awesome tier, and called the Mad Scientist, and got a Mad Scientist already. And so that's been awesome. And not only did Mike Ryan subscribe to our high tier on Shane Mauss, on the Shane Mauss Patreon, but on Mind Under Matter Patreon, the high tier as well. So huge supporter of the show. And I was like, damn, do you have any business? Do you have like a business or anything that you want to plug for? He didn't ask me. I reached out to him because I was thinking that I've been building more of a community. I've been getting to meet people on game nights, and we've been doing this like group overshare thing that just kind of skips past the small talk and just gets into talking about life and the things that I like blabbing about. And it's been fun meeting people, interacting with people on Discord and everything, and being more of a part of a community. And I just keep on, I don't want to offend anyone with this. If you go to church, cool. I don't mean to insult people's beliefs. I tend to be kind of a cynical, slightly judgmental person. And I don't mean to be, and I think there's value in it and everything else. But one of the things, so I just had a really bad relationship with church and religion and stuff growing up. It really alienated me a lot. But one of the things, especially as an adult, that I always did appreciate was that sense of community and bringing people with shared values, shared interests together. And, like my dad makes countertops, and he'd do like some countertops for the church or whatever. And it was a good way. And you're meeting people and figuring out what they do and their businesses in town. And then you're kind of supporting people within your like kind of value system within the community as well. And I just always thought that was really cool. And that was the one thing that and not that can't have some downsides as well. It's all like kind of groupthink sort of stuff can, but it was the one thing that I think adds so much value, and something that I've always thought, like, why isn't there that for people that aren't into this or that religion? Why isn't there that? That's what I was trying to do with stand-up science, is bring like-minded people out, and get to meet one another. I like the peace be with you sort of portion of church. I always thought that was the number one reason that it added value to people's lives. So with that, I was just like, do you have like a business or anything that you want to plug? Because I like the idea of like, oh, maybe you go out and support another Patreon's business or whatever. Rather, it didn't give me a script, or I didn't ask for a script. There's no expectations or anything. But he's in, he has a business, 𝕊𝕙𝕒𝕟𝕒𝕠𝕐𝕗𝑒𝑟𝑒𝕠𝕗.com. He does a marine and boat flooring. And guys, this is just like, I didn't know this was going to happen when I reached out to, but it's like, when I share with people that, if you've ever heard me say that I worked in a crouton factory for a while, and it always just cracks people up. And it's because it's one of those things in life where it's like, oh yeah, someone needs to do that. That's a job that you don't hear about that often. And I don't know if you guys have given much thought to boat carpeting, but if you've ever just like taken an hour out of your life and just been like, I quick scanned this site. Yeah, I'm not even telling, if you got a boat carpeting company that you already trust, by all means, I'm not telling you to go to boatcarpetoutlet.com, but I did think that I just started thinking you should pause, think about boat carpeting for a little bit, just, making boat carpeting, what boat carpeting's all about, and then just come back here and just see if you just arrived at some of the ideas that I have. Because, well, what you'll find out in a hurry is that a lot of people, including yourself, probably have never spent a lot of time thinking about boat carpeting. And it is important. There's whole outlets dedicated to it. A lot of people, you go into a carpeting place and you have this selection of carpeting. This is a big thing in a lot of people's lives. They go and they pick out what kind of flooring do I want in my home? Oh, okay. Do I want wood? Do I want, what's it feel like? What's the texture? I feel like a lot of times with boat carpeting, you go and you get the boat and you're just settling on whatever carpeting they have, and I think it's one of those aspects that you're thinking about the engine, you're thinking about like, how big is it, what am I using it for? And I bet the carpeting gets neglected a lot of times. Carpeting's one of those things that you have the boat for a while and you're like, it's just something about the feel of this carpet. Is all boat carpeting like this? Is this? And then you go on someone else's boat because people are, and then you're like, I like this carpeting so much more. And there has to be because you're feeling it on your feet. And you can't just so I had a friend who used to own a houseboat company, or his parents did. And so but the thing is, like, you have carpeting in your house. You're thinking about what if I drop a glass of wine on my carpeting? Then what? When you're talking about boat carpeting, you're talking about slopping fish on there. Just wet fish, kids' dirty feet. Everyone's slopping beers and everything all the time. It's getting soaking wet. There's a whole other, like, you must have to have some sort of like lattice under, like, I don't know if it's different kinds of fabrics. Haven't looked into it, but that someone has. I imagine probably, who do you think the first person to put in boat carpeting was? Like, it probably didn't go well. I bet they took household carpet, they threw it in a boat, and you didn't think about it. And because one, you got to think about the wear and tear of these things, because most people are going for color. You know, I had this, I was in this one relationship. This girl was, she was super into like redecorate. It was always painting projects. All these different. We're always like getting different ornamental things. April Macy's. We used to have a podcast together called the Double Date Podcast. We get into fights about this stuff all the time. I used to do some carpentry, and she never understood like that. There's framing behind these walls that you got to like screw things into and stuff like, and so it's not just aesthetics, because that boat carpet, guys, it might look good at first, but if you're not getting the right boat carpeting, you got to imagine boat carpeting, some cheap ass boat carpeting. I bet that boat carpeting, gets trashed in a hurry, you know? And so, I mean, be careful and think about it. Everyone wants is it a sail? How big of a sail is it going to be? How big of an engine am I going to have in this house? But you really got to think, what's this going to feel like? Because if you have a boat, yeah, there's people, you go out fishing or something like that by yourself, or you bring your kid out fishing, or a buddy or something like that. But if we're talking boat carpeting, you're entertaining. You know, you're having parties. Lots of people are seeing this. Like, that's a big part of, if you're getting a boat, you're showing off that, you know, you're a successful person who likes to have fun, and you don't want to miss little details. Like, it's the stuff people will never think of, because everyone's looking around, checking out they're wondering when they get to steer, if they get a turn steering the boat, you know, and getting to drive it a little bit. If you're a rookie, you don't get to back out from the dock. No, that's for the professional. That the boat owner does that. That's you let them back in and back out of the dock. But once you're out in the open, that's what you go on a boat. That's what you got your eye on the prize for. You're also looking for the coolers, for the what are you drinking on? Wine coolers. You got some Zima on that boat. I feel like Zima's a real boat kind of a beverage. If Zima, I'm not saying a lot of people drink boats on I'm just saying that of the Zimas that get drank in the world, a lot of them, like a disproportionate amount of Zimas get drank on a boat. So you're thinking about the Zima. You're thinking, when am I going to get to drive this thing? You're impressed. You're looking at the big engine, but you notice something. You notice just like a feeling on your feet, like I don't know. There's probably a lot of different fabrics. What do you want on your feet? Like a squishy, like you don't want it to be like gross, like a sloppy, but you do want that nice, like the bottom of a comfortable shoe. It's like a little imprint, but it's not, you can't have that stuff getting moldy. There's all these various variables that you got to consider when thinking about your boat carpet. And that's why, I mean, even at a top Patreon tier, is this anything what some regular ad would be paying me? No, it's not. It's not. And no one asked me to do this. But guys, I think that it's just when someone tells me, "Hey, I'm a fan of science, and I've done well. I found this obscure podcast, learned a bunch of science things. now I have a whole boat carpet empire. He didn't write that, but I imagine that's what Mike Ryan would have written if he would have gave me the whole spiel. I imagine that was kind of the origin story. Then you give back, and so if I could, if anything, I'm not telling you, like, I'm not trying to push you into getting boat carpet, even from the boatcarpetoutlet.com, even if you don't have a boat yet. Now I gave this fantastic, and you're like, well, maybe I just want to put boat carpet in my house. No, that's ridiculous. But in the tree house, kid has a tree house. You want to put some, like, some shag carpet in there or something like that? That's gonna, your kids are gross enough already. They're already covered in all sorts of germs, everything else. You want some gross ass carpet up there getting wet, them tracking stuff in everywhere. There's gonna be all sorts of wildlife growing in there, not like the fun kind that you can pet, just like microbes, hidden dangers, just because you just cut out some used carpet somewhere, threw it in your kid's treehouse. No, you got to put that boat carpet in your kid's treehouse. I imagine there's a lot of uses for boat carpets other than boats. That's the thing that I think they're probably underselling themselves. So, what, you got a deck? Maybe you want to carpet your deck. There's an area of your deck that you want to carpet. I don't know. I think at the very least, it's worth giving boat carpet some thought and thinking like, well, what is boat carpet made out of? Then you want to go to boatcarpetoutlet.com and learn more about boat carpet. All right, guys. And thank you for supporting me on Patreon. Thank you, Mike Ryan. You're a gem. It's awesome. 2 tiers. Didn't even ask me to plug boat carpet. I just got to plug. By the way, if you go join tier, like, oh, I wonder if Shane's going to go off an amazing rant about my business. Well, unlikely. I mean, what are you into? Is it something like boat carpet? Because I can riff about boat carpet all day long, but I don't have any guarantees with your business. I don't know what you're doing. I don't know. It's probably not as much fodder for comedy. A lot of people come up to you after a show and they'll be like, you got to come and check out my job. You get a lot of material out of that. Doubt it. Probably wouldn't. It's always the people that don't tell you. You got to ask people, what do you do? Oh, I wasn't going to mention I have a boat carpet outlet. That's the person that you always want to talk to. Always talk to the person who's not offering the information in the room. All right. That's a key lesson from today. All right, guys. You guys are awesome. Those of you lucky enough to listen all the way to the end and hear this ridiculous boat carpet rant, you guys are awesome. You're my favorites. Thanks so much for all the support. Thanks for listening. Thanks for spreading the word. Thanks for all the wonderful reviews and all that. And we'll talk with you more next week.